All right, today we're going to talk about congruent shapes. I want to remind you guys, we've already had the vocab word congruent before, but just as a reminder, congruent means equal, but it's when you're talking about shapes instead of numbers. Basically, equal is for numbers and congruent is for shapes. But what that means is if two shapes are congruent, they are absolutely 100% exactly the same. Every angle is exactly the same as the other one. Every side length is exactly the same as the other one. Same shape, same size, same exact everything. It's like you just made a copy of one of them to create the other. So let's go through some of our basic shapes that we started with, like line segments. When we talked about line segments, I told you guys there's a couple different ways that we can show line segments are congruent. One is we can mark them with a tiny little line on them to show that they're congruent. And you can use more than one line if you have more than one pair of congruent sides. The other thing is you can give their measure. Like if I have a picture and I say one line is 10 inches long and another line is 10 inches long, they're congruent because they're the same length. So those are the two ways in a picture that you might measure or you might show that line segments are congruent or the same. So let's look at this picture right here. And it's a little bit cut off. Let me take me out of there for now. So basically, if you're looking at this picture, they're kind of color-coded, which I shouldn't have done. But what's really important is that, like, if you look at the two green lines there, see how they have this one little mark right here and this one little mark right here. That mark means that they are congruent. So I could say that line segment AB, that's this one here, because it goes from point A to point B, is congruent to line segment CD. That's this one right here. Now look at the blue ones. What I did is I marked them again, but I put two lines on them. 1, 2 here, and 1, 2 here. Now what that means is that those two line segments are congruent to each other, but they're different from the green ones. I'm not saying all four are the same. If all four were the same, I would put one marker on each one. But what I'm saying is the two green ones are equal to each other, or congruent, and the two blue ones are equal to each other, but they're not all four the same. So from my picture from the two markers, I could also say that line segment PQ, that's the top blue one, is congruent to line segment RS, that's the bottom one. Now the other way that I said you could do this is what you see on the yellow ones. So over here I said, okay, let's pretend like I had a ruler and I measured this one and it was 5 centimeters. And I measured this one and it's 5 centimeters. I didn't put the little marker on those because I didn't need to. If they're both the same length, then they are automatically congruent. So I could also conclude from my picture that line segment LM is congruent to line segment JK. All right. So now let's talk about angles. Angles can be marked the same way using what we call arcs. So here's a picture of two angles that are being marked congruent. This thing that you see in them, this thing right here, and this thing right here, I just kind of highlighted it in red. Those are called arcs, and that means they're congruent. If those two angles are both marked with an arc, then that means they're the same, they're congruent. And I could do the same thing. If I had more than one angle in the page, I could do two arcs, like this. Or 3 or 4, however many you need. And it's the same as the little markers on the line. If two angles have one marker each, one arc each, they're congruent. If two different angles have two arcs each, they're congruent to each other, but not to the first two. So it basically works exactly the same as those little marks we did on the line segments. The other thing is I could also put a number in, same as the line segment. If I told you both of these angles are 20 degrees, then they're congruent because they're the same measure. All right, so now we get to congruent triangles, which is going to be one of our main focuses for a long time, actually. And I want you guys to realize, remember, congruent shapes mean exactly the same. So if two triangles are congruent, then every single one of their parts, corresponding parts, are also congruent or equal. That means all three angles of one triangle are the same as the other. They're not all three equal to each other, but that means like if you have two congruent triangles and one of them has a 20-degree angle, so does the other. And if one of them has a 100-degree angle, so does the other. They're exactly the same. And that's also true about the sides. If one of the side lengths is 10 inches, so is one in the other triangle. All 6 pieces, 3 angles, 3 sides are all exactly the same. And here's a picture. Here's 2 triangles, and these are color-coded again. But what you notice is the number of each thing. So remember how I told you, let's start with the sides. This one has one little marker over here between L and K. And this one has one little marker here between P and R. That means those 2 sides are congruent. So line segment KL is congruent to line segment PR. And then you can see there's one with 2 markers, those are the same. And there's one with 3 markers, those are the same. Now the angles are even easier to see because these are colored, but even if they weren't color coded, you can see like angle J has 1 arc on it, and so does angle Q, so those are the same. Angle R has 2 arcs on it, and so does angle K, so those are the same. And then angle P and angle L each have 3 markers, so they're the same. So even though the triangles, one of them's been kind of mirror image and rotated, they don't look exactly the same. They're not like perfectly right next to each other lined up. Those triangles are exactly the same. They're congruent triangles. And that's going to lead into our last topic for today. This, what you're seeing right now, is called a congruent statement. Congruence comes from the word congruent, and a statement is like a math equation. So basically a congruent statement is a statement that says 2 things are congruent. And that's what this is. It says triangle, the little triangle symbol means triangle, very simple. Triangle ABC is congruent to triangle XWY. And I just made those letters up. But if you notice in the notes there, I said the letters must be in the right order. That's very important. So let's go back to the example we just looked at. And let's write a congruent statement for this triangle. So when you're writing a congruent statement, the first thing you can do, I'm going to use the triangle symbol, pick one of the triangles and call it whatever you want. So I'm going to take this first triangle, the one there on the left, and I'm going to call it triangle PQR. PQR. And what I mean, when I say whatever you want, I mean take the 3 letters of the triangle and put them in whatever order you want. So it has to be the letters P, Q, and R, but if you wanted to, you could have called it RPQ or PR, whatever. But they do have to be the 3 letters from the triangle. All right, now we're going to say is congruent to, and we're going to say is congruent to the other triangle. Now here is where you have to be very careful, because you can't just throw them in any order on the second one. In fact, if you go, the reason I chose PQR is because it's alphabetical order. That's what we're used to saying, PQR. But if you do the same thing with the other triangle, it's actually wrong. If you go JKL, which is the letters in order, it would not be right. So this is where you have to be careful. The first letter that I chose was P. Now over here, P is the red angle, the one with 3 markers. That means the first letter has to be the same one. So it has to be L right here. And then you do the same thing for the middle one. The second letter I chose was Q. That's the green one with 1 marker. So the second letter over here has to be J. And then the third letter I picked was R, which is the blue one. So my third letter here has to be K. And that is our correct congruent statement. Remember, the first triangle you can name any way you want. Just pick the 3 letters and throw them in there. I usually go alphabetical order. It's simple. But for the second one, be careful that they match up in order. Whichever angle that you listed first on your first triangle, its congruent angle has to be listed first on the second one. And they each have to match up that way. So be careful in the congruent statements. Don't just throw the letters in any order. Remember what I said is it's natural for us to go alphabetical order. And if you did that for both triangles here, you actually would have been wrong. If you said triangle PQR is congruent to triangle JKL, the letters don't match up and that's not right. So be careful.